Hey, Susan, thank you so much for making yourself available.
Always great to be here.
Yes, and it's always great for me to have you. And I'm thrilled. First off, that you accepted my first invitation, my first ever invitation, and then you keep coming back as well. So it's worked out. Fingers crossed. So thank you so much because I've learned so much from you and also from Barbara, your colleague. And I'm going to have the links to prometheanaction.com in the description below, plus Susan's X profile and Promethean's Actions X profile. Just definitely follow them and follow their great work. And we're going to be looking at one of the things we're going to cover is the relationship between Donald Trump and the European, EU and UK leaders. That'll be very interesting. But primarily, we're going to be looking at this. Have you got your document there? Or is it on screen? It's on screen. Oh, you got yours there. Okay. I haven't finished reading mine, National Security Strategy. I have listened to some analysis of it. And also, I hear that the mainstream media in the UK has talked about its racism and white nationalism. So,
wow,
yeah,
I missed that.
I think it was in the Times. I didn't read the article. I just heard about it. I think it was in the Times. And before we came on, I was desperately looking in the Guardian to see what the Guardian had to say about it. Okay, it's Wednesday, the 10th of December. It's 2107. And Susan, do you want to start by giving, I don't know, a little bit of background perhaps to Promethean Action? Just a little bit, and then how it fits in with this and why is this important? And if so, why is it important?
Sure. No, Promethean Action is an outgrowth of a movement that's been around since the 1970s that was founded by Lyndon LaRouche. After his passing, different parts of the organization went in different directions, and Promethean Action really staked out its territory in terms of recognizing that Donald Trump represented a unique historical individual who, whether he put it in the same terms we do or not, is reviving the American system and the actual American tradition against what we call the British imperial system. I do have to say we have nothing to do with Helga Zepp-LaRouche and another part of the organization. And it was very much around the question of Donald Trump, because what Trump has done is challenge this imperial elite more dramatically than anybody in my lifetime. And my lifetime does go back to the middle of the last century. And I think you could make a pretty good argument that it is a greater challenge, living challenge, to this globalist imperial elite since the 19th century.
Wow. Wow. I recorded a video with Matt Ehret, author and historian. I think you're familiar with his work. And that hasn't gone out on my channel yet. So by the way, please like, comment, subscribe, do all that business. And we talked a bit about JFK, and I don't know much about JFK. And so it was an opportunity for me to understand. And he talked about JFK's principal policies: ending the Cold War, productive economy, working in an equal footing with the other nations. Like the first person he invited over was Nkrumah from Ghana. So I thought, bloody hell, and tariffs as well. The silverback dollar. And I thought, wait a minute, these all parallel or analogous to what Trump is doing. Except you wouldn't know that if all people do is accept the superficial, surface level, tabloid type MSM analysis.
And not just MSN. I mean, I'll throw in Fox News, because even on the conservative side of the political spectrum, the main problem you run up against in terms of understanding a Kennedy, understanding a Trump, and I'll put some of my MAGA friends' hairs on fire as well, understanding a Franklin Roosevelt, which they don't necessarily put in that same box, is the question of the fundamental fight in the world between an imperial system which has been headquartered in the city of London since before the time of the American Revolution, which has morphed into today's modern globalization and rules-based order and all the rest of the buzzwords that they use. But it's been a fight between that and the establishment of not only politically sovereign nations, but what the United States did with its founding, with Alexander Hamilton, with Hamilton's American system economic policies, is we established actual economic sovereignty from the central banking system run by the British. And unfortunately, most of the history of the last 100 and 120 years, the British have rewritten the history. So that fundamental conflict, which was well understood in the 19th century, and by some political factions through the early part of the 20th century, that essential fight has just been obscured And instead, we get these one-dimensional ideas of communism versus capitalism, or authoritarianism versus the democracies, or I don't know what's supposed to be opposed to a rules-based order, but by which they mean banker-run perpetual wars and free trade. But the fact that there was a very conscious alternative economic, strategic, and political system has been buried for most of the past 120 years. And that's what gets us to Trump's new national security strategy. He explicitly reasserts American system principles in this document. And this has flipped the wig of a lot of people.
It has flipped the wig. Before we started recording, I was just looking at The Guardian, looking through see what they had to say about it. And I'd heard that the Times, I haven't read this, but the Times said that this strategy is white nationalist, racist. And I've only read the first couple of pages. And the bit that struck me was creating an America which respects cultural, racial differences of other nations. And I'm like, that's pretty poor racism, that is, as racism goes, right? And then there's an article about what's it like living under an authoritarian country. And it had pictures of Viktor Orban, democratically elected, Donald Trump, democratically elected, and Bukele in El Salvador, democratically elected. Not the EU, by the way, not the European Union.
To put, the UK in there, getting rid of juries and all the rest of this stuff.
That's right. Okay, and so they are, the Europeans and the UK are, they're losing their hair. They're just going absolutely insane because the United States is no longer going to do its bidding in pushing for its wars to go and fight Russia on their behalf. And what I wanted to do is to go through the new strategy, because there is a bit on Europe. And I don't know how you want to do this. I haven't fully read it. I've just read the first 3 or 4 pages. So,
well, I think what's, to just start out, it's first of all, it's a direct, conscious attack on the elite's foreign policy of the entire period. I mean, I'll just read one thing from the introduction that I have in front of me. At the end of the Cold War, American foreign policy elites convinced themselves that permanent American domination of the entire world was in the best interests of our country. And, this goes on to say, no, we don't believe that. The affairs of other countries are our concern only if their activities directly threaten us. I mean, what I would keep in mind, and I encourage people to read this because you really can't do it justice, just sort of cherry picking different things from it, because you'll see it's thoroughly composed. It's a reassertion of the principles of American of sovereignty. Interwoven throughout it is the importance of economic sovereignty and a stress on the American worker. Really, when do you think you would ever have read a foreign policy document that says this? American policy will be pro-worker, not merely pro-growth, and will prioritize our own workers. We must rebuild an economy in which prosperity is broadly based and widely shared, not concentrated at the top or localized in certain industries or a few parts of our country. In other words, take that, cartels. We're not playing your game any longer. This is interwoven throughout. There's one point it kind of grabbed me where it's talking about foreign threats. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, here we come. Here's some kind of language. We're also conditioned, that somehow it's going to sneak back in there. And what they end up talking about is simply threats to our economic well-being, not military threats, but threats to our economic well-being by the fact that we've allowed an unbalanced trade. We've allowed other countries to take advantage of it. But it's a completely different conception. And I will mention, and I'm not recommending that you take the time to read this, but I don't know if I just discovered over the weekend when I was preparing my show, which I broadcast earlier, the British put out an identically named national security strategy in June of 2025.
Oh.
And yeah. And, if you line up certain things like the orientation toward NATO, where the Trump doctrine, actually I have that in front of me because I used it today, the Trump doctrine says, ending the perception and preventing the reality of NATO as a perpetually expanding alliance. And of course, Starmer and the British want to grow it, expand it, and so on. two different orientations toward Russia. The British doctrine says Russia is still enemy number one. And the Trump doctrine says that we want to achieve strategic stability with Russia and prevent, the war from getting out of control. You just line up some of these issues, and you're going to find complete polar opposites.
Okay,
Because one is based on the American principle of sovereignty and partnering with other countries in a world where everybody is growing and prospering. And the other is based on British geopolitics, which is we want to be able to control and manipulate the world, so that our central bank can squeeze the lifeblood out of you. And if you step out of line, we're going to start a lovely little war. It's just two completely different worldviews.
That's interesting. I'm going to look at that and compare them. And I imagine where, and I'm just saying this, and then I'm going to ask you a question, where the British one would say, "Oh, we're going to develop renewable energy, i.e., we're going to keep our citizenry cold and destroy our industry," and the American one would say, "Well, we're going to develop hydrocarbons and make cheap energy available for all," because you can't run a modern economy.
Lots of nuclear power.
Yeah, and nuclear power. You can't run a modern economy on certainly not in England on English sunshine.
Yeah, right. I'm in Michigan. I hear you.
All right, you get it, right? Okay. Now, how important is this document? And isn't this just it's just guff? It's just talking about it. It's more of the same propaganda by the neocons. They're going to say all this, and then any moment, off we go. 21st century of WMD in some poor oil-rich nation. So what about that?
I mean, I think what's important about this document, the American document, is that it institutionalizes what was already happening. I managed to sit through part of a Council on Foreign Relations webinar on this, because it's always important. Keep your eye on what the CFR is doing and the mothership, Chatham House. How are they responding to these kinds of things? And the CFR webinar was really very interesting, because what kept coming up in it is, well, we kind of hoped that when J.D. Vance went to Munich and mouthed off against Europe, that was a one-off and it wasn't really going to last. And now it's codified in this document, because the section of the world that is the most criticized in this document isn't China, isn't Russia, it's Europe. And Europe's trampling on actual real democratic principles, not their democracy versus authoritarian things. And so the moderator of this event, a woman named Listener, turns out she not only had been on Biden's national security staff with responsibility for Russia and Ukraine, she was one of the lead authors of Biden's national security strategy. So she's looking at this and saying, damn, everything we did is getting undone. And she kept coming back to the question of J.D. Vance, because she kept coming back to this. If the MAGA movement, is basically solidified, and Vance comes in 28 and continues this policy, we're toast. And I was reminded back in 2018, the British House of Lords wrote a foreign policy review. I think it was British Foreign Policy in a Changing World. And in there, they talk about Trump, and they're very clear that they are not happy about the direction Trump is taking. But they say in so many words, well, we can manage him for one term. And they talk about all their channels and their influence in the United States, but we won't survive 2 terms, is the message of that. And there were a lot of British actors involved in ensuring that Trump did not immediately serve a second term, but he's back. He's got more power, more confidence, more clarity, I would say, in terms of what the stakes are. And this document is a complete bombshell. But then you look at this CFR discussion, and they're basically saying, well, this is going to become permanent if J.D. Vance continues this in 2028. So you can bet, there's a smarter coterie in the elites who are thinking, well, we're going to do everything possible to sabotage this right now. We're going to do everything possible to take the House or the Senate or both away from Trump in 2026. And then the last part of his administration will be a disaster. But they're also thinking, okay, how can we just put an end to this permanently by ending whatever Trump is doing by 2028. And our job at Promethean Action is to make sure the American population sees through that and make sure that the Trump revolution goes along for a whole lot of generations.
Yeah. No, but what's the relationship between this document and actual government policy? Because I still feel like my question is unanswered. Like, isn't this just window dressing?
Well, they're actually doing it. I mean, if you look at Trump's peace plan, the 28-point peace plan, which of course is in the middle of all sorts of negotiations, but the Trump peace plan clearly recognized the legitimacy of Russian concerns, clearly does not want the 28 peace plan, the original version of it, doesn't want the expansion of NATO, wants to maintain Ukrainian neutrality. The 28-point peace plan has an enormous emphasis on economic development and interwoven throughout this national security strategy. You're going to read more about economic development and economic relations with other countries, frankly, than you are going to read about military strategy. So everything this is what Trump is already doing. Or if you look at the section on the Mideast, which struck me, is of course I'm looking there in terms of our most important ally in the Mideast is Israel über alles and so on. Outside of recognizing the legitimacy of Israel's security, this thing treats Israel no different than the Gulf states, than the other states in the region, and so on. And it all keeps coming back to economic development, economic development, economic development. So it's what Trump is doing. It's what he's been doing for 10 months. And you can see it in each region, Asia, Europe. I mean, Trump has not been happy with Europe. I think we've all noticed that. So he's just...
Susan, as a Briton and a European, I'm not happy with Europe either, just to be clear.
Hopefully. Now, probably the major section of this in terms of the refocusing and the concentration is this issue of the United States restoring the Monroe Doctrine and restoring the Western Hemisphere as its principal area of concern. And of course, people are calling it the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, because as they point out, and again, this is also interwoven throughout, this is where you actually do see legitimate security threats to the United States in terms of unbridled immigration, terrorism, and of course, drug trafficking and human trafficking and so on. And much of that is being conduited through Central and South America, hence the focus on Venezuela at this point as a nodal point, not a major drug producers. People say, oh, the drugs don't come from Venezuela, they come from elsewhere. It's a nodal point in a narco-trafficking terrorist apparatus, which absolutely threatens the United States. So there's a major pivot to pivot back to the Western Hemisphere, but again, and to deal with these security concerns. But again, interwoven throughout this is economic development. We want to have economic partnerships with other sovereign nations because it recognizes what should be obvious, unless you've been, trained at Oxford, that economic stability is really your basic building block for strategic stability. That, if you have economically stable, prosperous, peaceful nations, you're not going to have wars. If you have nations that have been looted, are destroyed, their middle class is hollowed out, or they've never had a middle class in the case of, the former colonial countries and so on, then you've got the cannon fodder for war. So if you look at what Trump has actually done in the first 11 months of his administration, in terms of his peacemaking, in terms of his economic deals, in terms of his reassertion of American economic sovereignty with tariffs, what you're reading in this document is it's written out in plain, actually in very plain language.
It's a very good read. It's a lot of official government papers are really dull and boring. This is not.
Clear. Okay. They wrote it for the American people to read it and understand it.
Yeah, it's very comprehensible. Okay, the Monroe Doctrine. Now, growing up as an old school British lefty activist, we all have past that we're ashamed of, right? Or have learned from. Actually, I'm not ashamed of it. But my understanding of the Monroe Doctrine is that it's US exerting imperial control over Southern and Central America. The death squads in Honduras and deposing Allende. isn't this what Trump's talking about? By the people talking about the Monroe Doctrine? Okay, we're now going to terrorize our backyard instead of the rest of the world. We're just going to terrorize our neighbors.
Well, let's go back to the original Monroe Doctrine, which was promulgated, in the first decades of the 19th century. What was the United States' major problem in the world when the Monroe Doctrine was written and issued? The major problem in the world was the British Empire and the French Empire. Those were our problems. And the Monroe Doctrine was written to say, we don't want empires in our hemisphere. We want our hemisphere to develop as sovereign, independent nations without primarily the British and the French interfering. That was the intention of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, it's understandable that people will then look at how various administrations in the United States have acted subsequently, and use either the phraseology or the so-called concept of the Monroe Doctrine to do something very, very different. We can start with Teddy Roosevelt, and his policies towards Central and South America were really just an arm of British imperial policies. Because, again, I'm going to ruffle the feathers. I'm sure some of my MAGA friends, Teddy Roosevelt did not pursue American policies. He pursued imperial policies. So you can see, I can understand why people say, oh, well, look at Teddy Roosevelt, or look at George Bush, or look at this, look at that. Look at all of these times when the United States played a negative role in South America, and where we did act something like an empire. But what I would argue, and I think you can show historically, whenever we've acted as like an empire, it's because we've been under the influence of institutions, ideologies, and in some cases, presidents and political leaders who are perpetrating the British imperial outlook and not genuine American sovereign interests. So when Trump is talking about the Monroe Doctrine, he's talking about the original one. He's not talking about how various people have misused the name, as the United States has acted too often as the dumb giant for imperialism in the 20th and 21st century.
Okay. Susan, I find you very difficult to talk to.
Uh-oh.
I'll tell you why. I keep having you back, right? And actually, I'm lying a little bit. I really enjoy our conversations. And I learned loads from you, right? I really have. The difficult bit is throwing curveballs to phase you, right? Because you're just not phased. So I'm going to keep trying because I have to present the other arguments, not necessarily ones that I agree with, right? But they're the ones that are presented to me. They're the ones that are out there. So here we go.
Well, let me tell you, that's extremely important, because as a student of Plato, that kind of dialogue between differing views and exploring, peeling back, and figuring out, okay, what's real? What's the underlying assumption that somebody is operating on? That's the only true meaning of dialogue. So keep pitching. Go ahead.
Okay, all right, thank you. By the way, if in the comments, if you think that there's some sort of curveball that I could throw at Susan next time she's on, let me know in the description below, right? But to be perfectly honest, what you're saying makes complete sense, and I want it to be true. But isn't this a bit Pollyannish? Like Trump's the great savior and everything, forgetting the fact that he's this clumsy oaf, the way that he talked about Somalis the other day, talking about garbage people from a garbage country. He's just rude and obnoxious, and he's the worst thing in the world. My cousins tell me.
Well, look, people should remember, first and foremost, the man's a New Yorker. And if you've never lived in New York, you're never going to understand.
He's not a polite, purse-lipped, covert British.
Yes, right. He's not a Harvard professor by a long shot. He gets along very well with longshoremen and Teamsters and the building trades and so on. He speaks their language. But people have to get over what we've been fed for recent decades, which is, it's about, the form. It's about how you look, how you say things, what you do. and not what you do.
Style over substance.
Yeah. And, I mean, I'll be honest, there's times I say to myself, ouch, really have to do that. And sometimes I will come to the conclusion that no, he didn't. But a lot of the time, I'll see there was actually perhaps a little bit of method to his madness. But again, when you look at what's in this national security document, it is constantly attacking the elites. It is constantly defending the workers, the economy, the middle class of the United States. Nobody has done that. You mentioned John Kennedy earlier. He was beginning to, but we were not in as bad shape in 1963 as we are in 2025. So it wasn't quite as stark. I mean, but he did have policies where he was going up against this kind of imperial banker Wall Street orientation, like trying to protect the steel industry in the conflict that was going on back then, and trying to figure out how to get productive credit into the economy. But this was at a much earlier phase of this thing. So if you take the period from John Kennedy to today, which is a couple of generations' lifetimes, right? Nobody has defended the American worker, middle class American economy in the way that Donald Trump is fighting for it, defending it, and beginning to actually rebuild it.
Yeah.
And that's the substance of it. And it's necessary for people to have a certain adultness around them. Like, you get the people, well, I haven't seen all the prices come down. Well, frankly, some of them have. I was paying $6 for a dozen eggs, and now I'm paying $1.99. I mean, some of the prices where Trump has been able to directly intervene on things like eggs, because it's only 45 days to create a chicken and an egg and all the rest of that stuff. He's brought down the price of energy dramatically. There's other areas where, if you pay attention, it's coming down. Actually, the place it's not coming down so much is the service sector. But there's a lot of things that are baked into the economy, like the housing shortage is a long-term problem. The fact that we have the lowest livestock herds in, 20, 30 years. And again, you don't snap your finger and, grow a cattle herd. There's times in there's time frame in the physical economy it's going to take to rebuild these things. So I think it's important for people, and that doesn't mean people aren't hurting. People are hurting. Frankly, they're hurting because of car insurance, house insurance, medical insurance. Again, service sector things, which are going to take much bigger structural changes in this. But if people understand the difference between an economy, which is just this hollowed out economy where everything is just a financial income stream to feed the insurance cartels or the food cartels or the banks and so on. And, you've got the very well off and the very poor and not too many people in the middle, and really no ability for the people at the bottom to ever see a way out of the economic disaster they're in. That's the direction this country has been going in for decades and decades. And Donald Trump is committed to reversing that. And so is most of his team. And so, again, if people just want to get caught up in some clickbait rage and, scream about all the prices or so on, again, there's a certain reality to that. But at the same time, people have to learn a little bit about how to run an economy. What does it take to reshore your manufacturing? What does it take to build up a cattle herd? What are the inputs that go into it? And Trump had a cabinet a meeting on Monday with ranchers and farmers, and they're taking some dramatic moves to try and ease the burdens on our agricultural producers in the United States, including coming down hard on, again, some of the cartels, the meat processing cartels and other cartels who are raking in the profits, while the guy who's actually growing who's actually got the hog farm or the cattle herd is getting killed because of the cost of inputs and so on. He is committed to taking each sector of the economy. And if people pay attention to that, and especially the people who are in these productive sectors, they love him. They love him because he's actually standing up for them.
Yeah. Well, it's really peculiar the way that the opposition to Trump has positioned itself, especially the left, the so-called pro-worker left, that they've been so manipulated and so given into various psyops, which really don't have any effect if people dig in. It's just superficial acceptance, and then you get psyops, right? That here's an American president whose substance is actually pro-worker, unlike that smooth talking, all style, no substance other than the substance of an assassin, very handsome, articulate Mr. Barack Obama. And to Trump's, I don't like what he said about Somalis, but you know, to his credit, he's not smooth. He's a human being, like Jeremy Corbyn is, unlike the fake people we've had before, like Tony Blair and Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, or a complete geriatric like Biden, who won't even have a press conference, won't even talk to the press.
For Trump, what you see is what you get.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's a lot more refreshing in my book, whether I always agree or not.
Yeah, and I would much rather, you know, okay, Trump does that, that's fine. That's just mean words. But what he's actually doing on the ground with the American people and also with other nations. And I just want to make a point, and then I want to move on to Europe, right? With regards to what's happening in Venezuela, in videos that I've covered with Ian Burlingham and Blaine Holt, it is about the drug trade, and also with Joaquin Phoenix as well. It's about the drug trade, but as a way of accessing the city of London, draining it of its illicit money flows, and the way that the CIA has operated as a drug cartel, an Uber drug cartel. So just wanted to make that point. People should go and watch those videos. Part 2 coming soon. Subscribe, comment, like.